The silence that heals. The baby's cry shattered the Texas heat like a gunshot. Silas Crow stood motionless on his porch, watching a woman walk through his gates, thin as drought-stripped mesquite, clutching an infant wrapped in flour sacking, eyes that had seen every kind of hell and refused to blink. His ranch hands had abandoned him that morning, cursing his name and the inedible slop he'd been serving. The notice he'd posted in town promised wages, nothing more. He'd expected drifters, maybe an old chuck wagon cook. Not this. Not a woman carrying life into a place where everything came to die. If you're watching from anywhere in this world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far May and Silas's story travels. Hit that like button and settle in, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about second chances. The Crow Ranch sat like a broken promise against the Texas horizon. 1,500 acres of stubborn land that fought back against every drop of sweat poured into it. The main house, built from limestone and cedar 2 decades prior, had weathered into something gray and permanent, its windows like closed eyes against the relentless sun. Cattle moved slowly across pastures where grass grew sparse and bitter, and the men who worked the land had learned to speak only when necessary, their voices worn smooth by wind and exhaustion. Silas Crow had built this silence deliberately. He stood on the porch that September morning, coffee cooling in his tin cup, watching the horizon with the practiced stillness of a man who'd forgotten how to expect anything good. 52 years old, weathered down to essentials, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a face that looked like it had been carved with a dull blade and left unfinished. His wife, Catherine, had been dead for 7 years. The memories of her had calcified into something he carried like stones in his pockets, weighing him down, but oddly necessary. The ranch hand's bunkhouse stood empty. All 6 men had walked off before dawn, leaving their bedrolls and taking only what fit in their saddlebags. Silas had found their foreman's note wedged under a rock on the porch rail. "Can't work on what you've been feeding us. Find yourself another crew." He'd crumpled the paper without reaction. The food situation had been deteriorating for months. Burned beans, rancid bacon, bread that could break teeth. He'd been doing the cooking himself since the last cook had quit, and Silas Crow knew cattle, horses, and hard ground. He didn't know the first damn thing about making food fit for human consumption. By mid-morning, he'd ridden into Redemption, the town that served the scattered ranches and homesteads of this brutal country. The general store's bulletin board was thick with notices, livestock auctions, land sales, desperate pleas for rain. Silas pulled out a pencil stub and tore a clean edge from a seed catalog. Cook wanted. Crow Ranch. Wages fair. Work hard. No complaints. He'd tacked it up without ceremony and ridden back, expecting nothing. Good help was scarce, and his reputation had spread. A hard man running a hard ranch, a widower who'd let grief turn him into something just shy of approachable. The afternoon heat built like a forge. Silas worked alone in the north pasture, repairing fence line that should have been maintained weeks ago. Sweat soaked through his shirt, and his hands bled where the barbed wire had caught him, but he kept working. Physical labor was the only thing that came close to quiet his mind, the only thing that made the hours pass without him noticing their weight. He didn't hear her approach. When he finally looked up, she was just there, standing 30 feet away beside the fence post he'd been heading toward, as if she'd materialized from the heat shimmer itself. A woman, rail-thin, wearing a dress that had once been blue but had faded to the color of old bruises. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face all angles and exhaustion. Sharp cheekbones, a mouth set in a line that suggested it had forgotten how to curve upward, eyes the color of creek water that held something that looked like determination wrapped around desperation. And in her arms, a baby. Couldn't have been more than a few months old, wrapped in what looked like flour sacking stitched together with careful hands. Silas straightened slowly, wire cutters hanging loose in his grip. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The baby made small sounds, not quite crying, just the quiet noises of discomfort in the killing heat. "You Silas Crow?" Her voice was low, roughened by dust or use or both. "I am." "You need a cook." It wasn't a question. Silas looked her over again. This woman who'd somehow walked miles in heat that would drop a strong man, carrying an infant, arriving at his ranch like some kind of mirage. Her dress hung loose on a frame that had known hunger. Her boots were held together with wire and hope. but her spine was straight and her eyes met his without flinching. "You cook?" he asked. "I do." "You got references?" Something flickered across her face, not quite humor, not quite pain. "I got hands that work and a memory that holds recipes. That's all the reference I can offer." Silas shifted his weight, considering. The baby chose that moment to let out a thin cry, and the woman adjusted her hold without breaking eye contact, one hand coming up to settle against the child's back in a gesture so automatic it spoke of countless repetitions. "You planning to cook with a baby strapped to you?" "I've done harder things with less." The simple honesty of it cut through his skepticism. Silas could recognize exhaustion when he saw it. It was what he looked at in the mirror every morning. But he could also recognize something else, the stubborn refusal to bend that came from having no other choice but to stay standing. "What's your name?" "May Wilder." "The baby?" "Emma." May's jaw tightened slightly. "She's mine. She goes where I go." Silas nodded slowly. "I pay $30 a month plus room and board. You cook 3 meals a day for however many hands I got working. Right now that's none. But I'll be hiring a new crew soon as word gets out I got decent food. You keep the kitchen, the cookhouse, and the stores organized. You got a problem with hard work?" "No." "You got a husband coming after you?" May's expression went perfectly still, and Silas saw something dangerous flicker in those creekwater eyes. "No." "All right then." He gestured toward the main house, visible in the distance. Cookhouse is attached to the south side of the main building. There's a room off the kitchen you can use. It ain't much." "I don't need much." "When can you start?" May shifted the baby higher against her shoulder, and for the first time, something that might have been relief softened the hard lines around her mouth. "Now, if you'll show me where the kitchen is." The cookhouse hadn't been properly cleaned in months. May stood in the doorway, taking in the cast-iron stove thick with grease, the work table scarred and stained, the shelves disorganized with supplies that looked like they'd been grabbed at random and never put back properly. Flour dust coated everything like a fine snow, and the smell of burned food hung in the air like an accusation. She didn't comment. She simply found a wooden crate, lined it with her shawl, and settled Emma inside where she could see her. The baby, mercifully, had fallen asleep during the walk from the fence line, tiny fist curled against her chest. Silas watched from the doorway, something uncomfortable moving through his chest at the sight of this woman and child in a space that had been empty of life for so long. "I'll bring in water," he said. May was already rolling up her sleeves. "Appreciate it." He made 3 trips from the well, filling the reservoir on the stove and the wash basin. By the time he finished, May had cleared the work table, swept the floor, and was organizing the pantry with quick, efficient movements that suggested she'd done this before, many times, in many places. "You got bacon that hasn't turned?" she asked without looking at him. "Should be some in the smokehouse." "Potatoes?" "Root cellar." "Eggs?" "Chickens stopped laying regular, but I can check." May finally turned to face him, wiping her hands on her skirt. "I'll make supper. You eat at sundown?" "Usually." "I'll call you when it's ready." It was dismissal, polite but firm. Silas found himself backing toward the door like a man who'd been told he was in the way, which he supposed he was. At the threshold, he paused. "May." She looked up. "There's a basin and pitcher in that room. Water's fresh if you need it." Something flickered in her expression, gratitude maybe, or surprise that he'd thought of it. She nodded once, and Silas left her to her work. The sun was setting fire to the western sky when the smell reached him. Silas had been in the barn, checking on a mare that had been favoring her front left leg, and the scent stopped him mid-stride. Bread. Actual bread. The kind that made your mouth water just breathing it in. And coffee. Real coffee. Strong enough to smell from 50 yards away. He walked to the cookhouse like a man approaching something he didn't quite trust. The door stood open to catch the evening breeze, and warm light spilled out from the oil lamps May had lit. She stood at the stove, her back to him, moving with the kind of practiced economy that came from years of making meals in difficult circumstances. "Wash up," she said without turning around. "There's a basin by the door." Silas did as instructed, scrubbing his hands and face with the harsh lye soap, watching May from the corner of his eye. She'd found an apron somewhere and tied it around her waist, though it hung loose on her thin frame. Her hair had begun escaping its pins, dark strands curling against her neck from the heat of the stove. The table had been set with simple efficiency: tin plate, cup, and fork. May brought over a cast-iron skillet and slid its contents onto his plate. Eggs scrambled with wild onions, bacon fried crisp but not burned, potatoes sliced thin and cooked until their edges had gone golden and crunchy. A slice of bread, actual bread, golden and steaming, sat alongside, with butter that had been kept cool somehow. Silas sat down slowly, staring at the plate like it might vanish if he looked away. "You ain't eating?" he asked. "I'll eat after." May moved back to the stove, checking something in the oven. "You're paying me to cook for you, not sit with you." "I'm paying you to cook. Didn't say nothing about you starving yourself." Silas pushed his chair back and stood, fetching another plate from the shelf. He divided his portion in half, sliding one plate across the table. "Sit." May turned, and for a moment they engaged in a silent battle of wills. Silas could see the pride in her, the kind that made accepting anything, even basic kindness, feel like a loss. But he could also see the bone-deep exhaustion, the way her shoulders sagged when she thought he wasn't looking. "I ain't asking," Silas said quietly. "I'm telling. You work here. You eat here. You can't cook if you collapse from hunger." May's jaw worked like she was chewing over a response, but finally she moved to the table and sat down across from him. She picked up her fork with careful deliberation, cutting a small piece of egg. Silas took his first bite and nearly groaned. It was simple food, nothing fancy, but it tasted like something a human being had made with actual care. The eggs were seasoned perfectly, the potatoes had the right amount of salt, and the bread— God, the bread was still warm, dissolving on his tongue like a benediction he hadn't known he needed. They ate in silence, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence that had filled this ranch for years. It was something different, the quiet of two people too tired for conversation, too hungry to waste time on words. May ate slowly, deliberately, like someone who'd learned to make small portions last. In her crate by the wall, Emma stirred and whimpered. May was on her feet instantly, but Silas noticed how she swayed slightly, catching herself against the table edge. "Finish your food," he said. "Baby ain't screaming yet." May hesitated, then sat back down, though her eyes kept darting toward the crate. She ate the rest of her meal quickly, then went to Emma, lifting her with the kind of gentle certainty that spoke of love worn into muscle memory. "I'll clean up," Silas said, standing. "You tend to her." "That's not— May." He looked at her directly, letting her see that he meant it. "I can wash a plate." She studied him for a long moment, this hard man who was offering small kindnesses like a person relearning how to speak a forgotten language. Finally, she nodded and carried Emma toward the small room off the kitchen. Silas gathered the plates and began washing them in the basin, the simple rhythm of the work oddly soothing. Through the open door he could hear May's voice, low, gentle, murmuring things he couldn't make out to the baby. It was the first soft sound this house had held in 7 years. He dried his hands on a towel and walked to the doorway of May's room. She sat on the narrow bed, just a straw mattress on a rope frame, but clean and serviceable, with Emma at her breast, her hand curved protectively around the baby's small head. Her eyes were closed, and in the lamplight, she looked younger than he'd first thought. Maybe 30, maybe less. Hard living had a way of aging people before their time. "Thank you," Silas said quietly, "for the meal." May opened her eyes. "It's what you're paying me for. Still deserves thanks." She nodded, and Silas turned to leave, then paused. "You need anything? You let me know. Wood for the stove, water, whatever you need to do your work." "I will." "And May, you did good today. Real good." He left before she could respond, walking out into the cooling night where the stars were beginning to emerge like scattered seeds across black soil. The ranch looked the same as it always did, hard-edged and unforgiving in the darkness. But something had shifted, some barely perceptible change in the air, like the moment before a drought finally breaks. Inside the cookhouse, May sat with her daughter and let herself believe, just for a moment, that maybe she'd found a place where she could stop running. May woke before dawn, the habit so ingrained that her body knew the hour without needing light. Emma slept beside her in the makeshift cradle Silas had apparently brought in while May slept. A proper wooden box with rockers, old but sturdy, lined with a blanket that smelled of cedar. May stared at it for a long moment, something tight loosening in her chest. She rose quietly, splashed cold water on her face, and changed Emma's diaper cloths. The baby grumbled but didn't wake, and May settled her back in the cradle before heading to the kitchen. The pre-dawn silence was different here than in the places she'd been before. No sounds of men stirring in close quarters, no harsh voices or rougher hands, just the quiet breath of a ranch still sleeping and the distant sound of cattle settling in their pastures. May built up the fire in the cook stove, grateful that Silas had left kindling ready. Within minutes, she had coffee brewing, real coffee from the sealed tin she'd found in the pantry, not the chicory and acorn mixture she'd been drinking for months. The smell alone felt like luxury. She mixed biscuit dough with quick, practiced movements, cutting rounds and placing them in the cast-iron Dutch oven. While they baked, she fried more of the bacon, scrambled eggs with dried peppers she'd found hanging in the pantry, and made gravy from the bacon drippings, flour, and milk from the cold box. When Silas walked in an hour after sunup, his hair still damp from washing at the pump, he stopped dead at the sight of the table laid out with food. "You do this every morning?" he asked. "You expect to eat every morning?" May countered, pouring coffee into his cup. The corner of Silas's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close enough to count. He sat down and began eating without ceremony, and May noticed he took 3 biscuits this time, slathering them with butter and honey like a man who'd been starving without knowing it. "I'll be riding to town today," Silas said between bites. "Posting word that I'm hiring again. Figure with food like this, I'll have more hands than I need by week's end." May nodded, refilling his coffee. "You need supplies from town while you're there?" "You got a list?" She pulled a folded paper from her apron pocket and handed it to him. Silas scanned it, his eyebrows rising slightly at the precise inventory. Specific amounts of flour, sugar, salt, lard, dried beans, rice, coffee, baking powder, and a dozen other items. "You want all this?" "If you want me to keep feeding people properly, yes." May met his eyes steadily. "You can't make good food from nothing." "Fair enough." Silas folded the list and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Anything else?" May hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Fabric. Just a couple yards of cotton. I can pay you back for my wages." "What for?" "Emma's growing. She needs new clothes." Silas studied her for a moment, seeing the pride that made her offer payment, the determination not to ask for anything that wasn't earned. "I'll get the fabric. You can make me some new dish towels with what's left over. Consider it part of your wages." May's expression flickered, surprise, then something softer. "All right. You need anything else for yourself?" "No." "May." Silas's voice was quiet but firm. "You're living in my cookhouse, working dawn to dark. If you need something, you tell me. That's part of the arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment, this hard man who spoke in commands but somehow made them sound like care. "Soap," she said finally. "The gentle kind, for Emma's skin." "I'll get it." After Silas left for town, May cleaned the kitchen until it gleamed, then took inventory of the pantry properly. What she found told her stories: supplies bought without planning, things purchased in quantity and then forgotten, good ingredients going to waste beside spoiled ones. It was the pantry of a man who'd stopped caring about the details of living, who'd been surviving rather than existing. She spent the afternoon reorganizing everything, throwing out what had turned, consolidating what remained, scrubbing shelves until her hands were raw. Emma slept or watched from her cradle, content in the way babies were when their mother's anxiety had eased enough to let them breathe. By the time Silas returned, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies, the pantry was transformed. He helped her unload without comment, carrying sacks of flour and sugar like they weighed nothing, stacking tins and crates where May directed. "Got your fabric," he said, handing her a wrapped parcel. "And the soap. Clerk said it's what they use for babies." May unwrapped it carefully, 3 yards of soft blue cotton and a bar of Castile soap that smelled faintly of lavender. "Thank you." Silas nodded and pulled a smaller package from his saddlebag. Also got this. Figured you might need it. Inside was a nursing shawl, simple but well-made, soft cream-colored wool. May stared at it, something rising in her throat that she had to swallow hard against. I can't. You can, Silas interrupted. You're working for me. You need to be able to do your job without worrying about privacy. That's just practical. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but it was the kind of lie that let May accept it without her pride shattering, and she was grateful for it. Thank you, she said again, quieter this time. That evening's meal was beef stew made with vegetables May had found in the root cellar and beef from the smokehouse, served with more of her bread. Silas ate 3 bowls and didn't speak until he'd finished, just sat with the kind of deep contentment that came from a belly finally satisfied. I'll have men arriving tomorrow, he said, pushing his bowl away. Maybe 4, maybe 6. They'll want to see what they're getting before they commit. May nodded. I'll make breakfast worth committing to. I believe you will. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. May, you done good here. Real good. This place already feels different. May watched him walk back toward the main house, his broad shoulders outlined against the darkening sky. She stood in the doorway of the cookhouse, Emma sleeping in her arms, and looked out at the ranch that was starting to feel less like a temporary stop and more like something that might become permanent. The wind moved through the mesquite trees, carrying the smell of dust and cattle and the faint promise of change. May breathed it in and let herself hope. Book. The hands arrived over the next 3 days, drawn by word of decent wages and better food, by the news that Silas Crow had found himself a cook who could actually feed a man properly. They came cautious, weathered men who'd worked hard ranches and knew better than to expect comfort. What they found exceeded every expectation. May fed them breakfasts of eggs and bacon, biscuits with gravy, fried potatoes with onions, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She packed their midday meals in tin pails, sandwiches of roast beef or ham, apples when she could get them, cookies that didn't taste like saddle leather. For supper, she made stews and roasts, beans flavored with salt pork and molasses, cornbread that crumbled sweet and golden on the tongue. The men ate like starving wolves for the first 2 days, barely speaking, as if afraid the food might vanish if they drew attention to it. By the 3rd day, they'd begun to relax, talking quietly among themselves, complimenting May's cooking with the kind of reverence usually reserved for holy things. She learned their names and preferences without asking. Jack liked his coffee barely colored, more milk than brew. Tom couldn't stomach onions but was too polite to say so. She simply stopped putting them in his portions. Young Billy, who couldn't be more than 17, needed extra food, his growing body burning through calories like a furnace. May noticed everything and adjusted accordingly, her silence more observant than most people's conversation. Silas watched it all from a distance, seeing his ranch transform in ways that had nothing to do with repair work or cattle management. The men walked different, less hunched, more purposeful. They spoke different, fewer curses, more courtesy. They worked different, harder, but with less resentment, as if decent food had reminded them they were human beings worthy of care. And at the center of it all was May, moving through the cookhouse like a quiet storm, Emma strapped to her back in a sling she'd fashioned from old flour sacking. The baby had become a kind of ranch mascot. The men would tip their hats to her, making silly faces that occasionally earned them a gummy smile. Miss May's got this place running better than any foreman could, Tom said one evening, watching her organize supplies with the precision of a military campaign. She don't waste nothing, don't complain about nothing, just makes it all work somehow. Silas nodded, unable to disagree. In 2 weeks, May had transformed his ranch from a place men endured to a place they chose to stay. And she'd done it without raising her voice, without demanding anything, just through the steady application of competence and care. But he'd also noticed other things. The way she moved carefully, as if always conscious of taking up too little space. The way she flinched slightly when any of the men approached too quickly. The way her eyes tracked the horizon at sunset, like she was always watching for something to come over it. One evening, after the hands had eaten and retired to the bunkhouse, Silas found May in the cookhouse scrubbing the already clean stove. Emma slept in her cradle, and the lamps burned low, casting long shadows across the walls. "May," Silas said from the doorway. She turned, surprised. "Something wrong with supper?" "No, supper was perfect. It's always perfect." He stepped inside, hat in his hands. I wanted to ask you something. May set down her scrub brush, wariness settling over her features like a veil. All right. You planning to stay, or is this just temporary for you? The question hung in the air between them. May's hands tightened on the edge of the stove, her knuckles going white. I don't know, she said finally, honest in a way that must have cost her. I don't know what comes next. I never do. You running from something? May's jaw tightened. I'm running towards something. There's a difference. What are you running toward? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and Silas saw past the exhaustion to the fierce determination underneath. A place where Emma can grow up without shame, where I can work without owing anyone anything I don't want to give, where I'm judged by what I can do, not by what's been done to me. Silas nodded slowly. You think you can find that here? I don't know yet. May's voice softened slightly. Can I? I can't speak for the whole world, Silas said carefully, but on this ranch, you work for your wages, you earn your keep, and nobody asks questions you don't want to answer. That's the deal. That's all it needs to be. May searched his face, looking for the lie, the condition, the price that would come due later. Silas let her look, keeping his expression open, letting her see that he meant exactly what he'd said. Nothing more, nothing less. All right, May said finally. Then I'll stay. For now. For now is good enough. Silas turned to leave, then paused. May, whatever you're running from, whatever happened before you got here, it don't matter to me. You're doing good work. You're making this place better. That's all I need to know. He left before she could respond, walking out into the night where the stars burned cold and distant overhead. Behind him, in the warm glow of the cookhouse, May Wilder stood with her sleeping daughter and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could finally stop looking over her shoulder. The ranch settled into its new rhythm like a bone finally set properly after a bad break. And in the silence that Silas Crow had built deliberately, something new was beginning to grow, something that looked almost like healing. The morning Tom collapsed, May had been kneading bread dough at the kitchen table. Flour dusted across her forearms like snow. Emma dozed in her cradle near the warmth of the stove, and the early light slanted through the windows in pale gold bars. The rhythm of her work had become meditative, press, fold, turn, press, when she heard the shout from outside. Silas, something's wrong with Tom! May's hands stilled. She wiped them quickly on her apron and moved to the window. In the yard between the bunkhouse and the barn, Tom was on his knees, one hand clutching his stomach, the other braced against the ground. Jack and Billy stood over him, uncertain, while Silas strode across the yard with that ground-eating walk of his. May didn't hesitate. She checked Emma, still sleeping, and went outside. By the time she reached them, Tom was on his side, curled tight, his face gray and slicked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Silas knelt beside him, one hand on the man's shoulder. What hurts? Silas asked, his voice steady but urgent. Everything, Tom gasped. Stomach feels like it's on fire. Can't breathe right. May pushed past Jack and dropped to her knees on Tom's other side, her hands already moving to check his pulse at his wrist. Too fast, too thready. She pressed her palm against his forehead. Fever, but not dangerously high. She looked at his eyes. Pupils normal, but the whites were slightly yellowed. When did this start? She asked Tom directly. Woke up feeling poorly. Thought it was just something I ate wrong. What did you eat that the others didn't? Tom's breath came in short gasps. Nothing. Same as everyone. May's mind raced through the meals she'd prepared. Everyone had eaten the same food at breakfast, the same stew last night. If it was food poisoning, they'd all be sick. She looked at Tom's hands, rough, calloused, but she noticed something. A small cut on his thumb, inflamed and weeping. Where'd you get that cut? A few days back, working the north fence line. Caught it on some rusty wire. May felt something cold settle in her stomach. Billy, go get me clean water, hot as you can manage. Jack, I need the medical kit from the cookhouse. It's on the shelf above the dry goods. And bring me the bottle of whiskey from the cabinet. The men moved immediately. Silas stayed where he was, watching May with an expression she couldn't quite read. You know what this is? He asked quietly. Maybe. I need to check something first. May turned back to Tom. I'm going to look at that cut. It's going to hurt. Can't hurt worse than this, Tom managed. May unwrapped the dirty bandage Tom had tied around his thumb. The smell hit her first, the sweet rot stink of infection gone deep. The cut itself was small, maybe an inch long, but the skin around it had turned an angry red that streaked up his hand toward his wrist. When she pressed gently near the wound, Tom cried out, and fresh pus oozed from the opening. Blood poisoning, May said, sitting back on her heels. The infection's spreading. That's what's making you sick. Silas's expression went hard. How bad? Bad enough. If we don't stop it, it'll kill him. Billy returned with a basin of steaming water, and Jack came running with the medical kit and whiskey. May took both, organizing her supplies with quick efficiency that spoke of experience she'd never explained. Tom, I need to clean this wound properly. It's going to hurt worse than anything you've felt yet, but if I don't do it, you'll lose the hand at best, your life at worst. You understand? Tom nodded, his face sheened with sweat. Do it. Silas, hold his arm steady. Jack, Billy, one of you hold his other arm, one hold his legs. He's going to fight when I start. The men positioned themselves. May poured whiskey over her hands, then over the knife she'd pulled from the medical kit. She met Tom's eyes once more. I'm sorry for this, she said. Then she went to work. May reopened the wound with the knife, ignoring Tom's screams as she cut away the infected tissue. Blood and pus flowed freely, and she squeezed the wound deliberately, forcing out everything that had gone bad. Tom thrashed hard enough that it took all three men to hold him, but May's hands never wavered. She flushed the wound with whiskey. Tom's screams reached a pitch that sent birds exploding from the nearby trees, then packed it with clean cloth soaked in a mixture she'd made from herbs she'd been growing in pots by the cookhouse window. Yarrow to stop bleeding, golden seal for infection, comfrey to help healing. Where'd you learn this? Silas asked, his voice strained from the effort of holding Tom still. Places where there weren't doctors, May said simply, wrapping the wound with clean bandages. Times when you either learned or you buried people. When she finished, Tom had passed out from the pain, which May counted as a mercy. His breathing was steadier, though, and the gray pallor was already fading from his face. Get him to the bunkhouse, May instructed. Keep him lying down. I'll make a tea that'll help with the fever and the pain. He needs to drink it every 4 hours, and that bandage needs changing twice a day. I'll show you how. You'll do it, Silas said. It wasn't a question. I got a kitchen to run and a baby to tend. I can't. You just saved his life, May. Nobody else here knows what you know. Silas's voice was firm, but not unkind. I'll watch Emma. You take care of Tom. May opened her mouth to argue, then saw the absolute certainty in Silas's face. She nodded once, sharp. All right, but I need to make him that tea first. The men carried Tom to the bunkhouse while May returned to the cookhouse. Emma had woken and was beginning to fuss, and May felt the familiar pull of worry. She couldn't leave her daughter, couldn't trust her to just anyone, even for a moment. Silas appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her thoughts. I meant what I said. I'll watch her. You don't know how to... I raised cattle from birth, broke horses that wanted to kill me, and ran this ranch through drought and disease. I reckon I can keep one small baby alive for an hour. He stepped closer, his voice gentler. May, you saved Tom's life. Let me help you do your work. May looked at Emma, then at Silas, warring with herself. Trust was a currency she'd learned not to spend freely, but something in Silas's steady gaze, in the careful way he'd spoken, made her take the risk. She'll need feeding in about an hour, May said, reaching for the nursing shawl Silas had bought her. I'll be back before then. If she cries, rock her. Sometimes she just needs to be held. I can do that. May showed him how to support Emma's head, watched him settle the baby against his broad chest with surprising gentleness. Emma looked impossibly small in his arms, but she didn't cry, just studied his weathered face with solemn curiosity. I'll be quick, May said, gathering the herbs she needed. She spent the next hour in the bunkhouse, tending to Tom while the other hands watched with the kind of reverence people showed when witnessing something they didn't fully understand. She brewed her tea from willow bark and feverfew, made him drink it despite his protests about the bitter taste, and changed his bandage while explaining to Jack exactly how to do it. You wash your hands first, always, May instructed, demonstrating. Use hot water and soap, get them clean as you can. Then you unwrap the old bandage, check for fresh pus or red streaks. If you see red streaks spreading, you come get me immediately, understand? That means the infection's still moving. You clean the wound with this solution. She held up a bottle she'd prepared. Then apply fresh herbs and re-bandage. Keep it tight enough to hold, loose enough to breathe. Jack nodded, committing every word to memory like scripture. When May finally returned to the cookhouse, she found Silas sitting in the rocking chair she'd never seen him use, Emma asleep against his shoulder. He was humming something low and tuneless. One large hand curved protectively around the baby's small back. The sight stopped May in the doorway. Something about it, this hard man made soft by an infant's trust, struck her deep in a place she'd thought she'd armored over. Silas looked up and saw her watching. She got fussy about 20 minutes ago. Rocking seemed to help. May crossed the room and carefully transferred Emma to her own arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her small fist curling against May's chest. "Thank you," May said quietly. "How's Tom?" "He'll live. Fever should break by tomorrow if the infection doesn't spread. I'll need to check on him regular, change his bandages twice a day until it heals clean." Silas nodded. "Whatever you need to do. The men can fend for themselves at midday if necessary." "I'll manage both." May settled into the chair Silas had vacated, still warm from his body. "I always do." Silas studied her for a long moment. This woman who'd walked into his ranch carrying a baby and asking for nothing but a chance to work, who'd turned his cookhouse into something that felt almost like a home, who'd just saved a man's life with knowledge she'd learned in places she never spoke about. "You're full of surprises, May Wilder." May met his eyes, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she let him see past the careful walls she kept up. "I've had to be." That evening, May made a simple supper of bean soup and cornbread, but she also prepared a special broth for Tom, rich with beef bones and vegetables, seasoned with herbs meant to strengthen and heal. She carried it to the bunkhouse herself, Billy trailing behind her like a concerned puppy. Tom was awake, propped against pillows that Jack had clearly fussed over arranging. The fever had broken, and though he was weak, the dangerous gray pallor was gone. "You look better," May said, settling on the stool beside his bunk. "Feel like I've been trampled by a whole herd, but I'm alive." Tom's voice was rough but genuine. "Jack told me what you did. Said you cut me open without flinching. Infection needed to come out. Still, I know it weren't easy." Tom's eyes were serious. "Thank you, Miss May. I owe you my life." May shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what needed doing." "That's more than most people do." Tom accepted the cup of broth she offered, drinking it in small sips. "Where'd you learn all that? The healing, the herbs, the cutting?" May was quiet for a moment, and Tom saw her face close off slightly, the walls coming back up. But then she surprised him. "I was married once," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "to a man who worked logging camps. Dangerous work, men getting hurt all the time. The camp was too far from any town for a doctor, so the women had to learn. I learned from an older woman there. She'd been a nurse during the war, knew things that saved lives. When men got hurt, we did what we could." "What happened to your husband?" May's hands tightened on the cup. "Tree fell wrong. Killed him instant. I was already carrying Emma then." Tom had the sense not to push further. "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." May took the empty cup back. "You need rest. I'll check on you before bed, change that bandage again." She left before he could thank her again, stepping out into the cooling evening. The sky was doing that thing it did in Texas, turning colors that didn't seem possible. Orange bleeding into purple, streaked with pink, like an open wound healing. May stood for a moment, just breathing, letting the story she'd told settle over the truth like a blanket covering something sharp. She'd been married, that part was true. The rest, the logging camp, the fallen tree, was a story she'd constructed carefully, one that explained Emma without inviting questions about shame or judgment. It was easier than the truth, kinder to both herself and her daughter. Silas found her there, standing in the yard between the bunkhouse and the cookhouse. silhouetted against the sunset. Tom doing all right? He'll heal. Keep him off work for a week at least. Light duty for another week after that. We'll manage. Silas moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and somehow comforting in its quietness. You did good today, May. I did what anyone would do. No. Most people would have panicked or done the wrong thing or just stood there hoping someone else would handle it. You knew what to do and you did it, even though it was hard. Silas paused. That takes something special. May turned to look at him, this man who kept offering her small recognitions like gifts she didn't know she needed. It just takes necessity. When there's no one else, you become whoever you need to be. Is that what you've been doing? Becoming whoever you need to be? The question was gentle, but it struck close to something true. May looked back at the sunset, watching the light bleed out of the sky. Every day of my life since I was old enough to understand that the world doesn't care what you need, only what you can provide. Silas nodded slowly. I understand that. This ranch, it's been the same, just survival, day after day, until you forget there could be anything else. What changed? May asked. Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, you did. You and Emma. You walked through my gates and reminded me that survival isn't the same as living. May felt something shift in her chest, some careful distance she'd been maintaining beginning to close. It scared her, this feeling of being seen, of mattering to someone beyond what she could provide. But it also felt like the first full breath she'd taken in years. I should get back, she said, not moving. Emma will be hungry soon. May. Silas's voice stopped her. Whatever you were before you came here, whoever you had to be, you don't have to be that person here. You can just be yourself. What if I don't know who that is anymore? Then I guess you got time to figure it out. May nodded and walked back toward the cookhouse, feeling Silas's eyes on her back like a weight that somehow didn't press down. Inside, Emma was beginning to wake, her small sounds pulling May back into the immediate needs of motherhood. But as she fed her daughter and cleaned the kitchen and prepared for the next day's work, May found herself thinking about Silas's words. Time to figure it out. She'd been running so long she'd forgotten that stopping might be possible, that there could be a place where she wasn't just surviving, but actually building something. The next week passed in a rhythm that began to feel almost normal. May tended Tom's wound twice daily, watching with satisfaction as the angry red infection receded and healthy pink tissue began to fill the cut. She made special meals to strengthen him, beef broth with vegetables, eggs scrambled soft for easy eating, bread soaked in milk when his stomach was still unsettled. The other hands watched her work with something approaching awe. Billy started bringing her things, a handful of wild herbs he'd found, thinking they might be useful, a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree, carefully preserved because it was beautiful, and he thought she might like beautiful things. Jack repaired the steps to the cookhouse without being asked, then fixed the loose board in May's room, then started finding other small tasks that might make her work easier. You've got them half in love with you, Silas observed one evening, watching Jack carry May's water buckets from the well without prompting. May shook her head. They're grateful, that's all. Tom would have died without intervention. They know it. It's more than that. Silas leaned against the cookhouse doorway, hat in his hands. They see you working yourself to exhaustion taking care of them. They see you making this place feel less like a prison and more like a home. That inspires loyalty. I'm just doing my job. May, you do everything like it's just your job. Doesn't make it less remarkable. May felt heat rise in her cheeks and turned back to the stove, hiding her face. Compliments made her uncomfortable. They felt like debts she'd eventually have to repay. By the second week, Tom was back on light duty, his hand healing clean and straight. He'd regained his color and his appetite, though May noticed he was gentler now, more thoughtful. Near death had a way of changing people. It was Tom who first noticed the cattle acting strange. Boss, he said to Silas one morning at breakfast, something's wrong with the herd in the south pasture. They're moving funny, bunched up tight, not spreading out to graze like they should. Silas frowned. Weather's been fine. No predators we've seen. I know, that's what's got me worried. After breakfast, Silas and the hands rode out to check the herd. May watched them go, then turned her attention to the day's work. Bread that needed baking, beans that needed soaking, washing that had piled up. Emma played on a blanket near the stove, grabbing at the wooden spoon May had given her to teeth on. Silas returned 3 hours later, his expression grim. He found May hanging laundry on the line she'd strung between two posts. "We got a problem," he said without preamble. "Cattle are sick. Don't know with what yet, but we've lost 2 calves since this morning, and 3 more cows are looking poorly." May's hand stilled on the sheet she was hanging. "What are the symptoms?" "Drooling, stumbling, won't eat. One of the calves had blood coming from its nose before it died." May's mind raced through possibilities. Diseases she'd heard of, remedies she'd learned. "The south pasture. What's the water source there?" "Creek that runs along the western edge. Why?" "Show me." Silas looked at her, surprised. "May, you don't need to. If it's the water, it'll keep killing your cattle until you find the source. I might be able to help." May turned toward the cookhouse. "Let me get Emma settled with Billy. He can watch her for an hour." 20 minutes later, May was riding behind Silas on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, heading toward the south pasture. She'd never ridden much, couldn't afford a horse in her previous life, but she held on tight and tried not to think about how close she was to this man, how solid he felt, how his warmth seeped through his shirt into her palms. The south pasture stretched across rolling grassland, and the creek cut through it like a silver ribbon. Silas helped May down from the horse, his hand steadying her until she found her footing. They walked along the creek bank together, May scanning the water and the ground around it with careful attention. She found it a quarter-mile upstream, a dead deer, bloated and rotting in the water, caught against some rocks. The smell hit her first, then the sight of the greenish water around it, thick with decay. "There," May said, pointing. "That's your problem. The carcass is poisoning the water. Your cattle have been drinking it for days, maybe weeks." Silas cursed under his breath. "How do we fix it?" "Get the carcass out first. Then you need to keep the cattle away from this water until the creek flushes clean. At least a week, maybe more depending on the flow. They'll need another water source. We can drive them to the north pasture, use the pond there." Silas was already planning, his mind working through logistics. "It'll be crowded, but better than losing the whole herd." They worked until sundown, Silas and the hands hauling the deer carcass out of the creek and burying it far from any water source, then driving the cattle north to safety. May returned to the cookhouse and made a huge supper, knowing the men would come back exhausted and starving. When they finally stumbled in, covered in mud and reeking of dead deer and cattle panic, May had beef stew waiting, thick with vegetables and rich with flavor. Fresh bread, still warm. Coffee, strong enough to revive the dead. The men ate in grateful silence, too tired for conversation. But when Tom pushed his empty bowl away and looked at May with something like reverence, the others nodded in agreement. "You saved us again, Miss May," Tom said quietly. "If you hadn't found that deer, we'd have lost half the herd before we figured it out." May shook her head. "I just looked at what was there. Anyone could have done it." "But they didn't," Silas said, his voice carrying weight. "You did." That night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse and Emma was asleep, May sat in the kitchen trying to process what had happened. She'd saved Tom's life, then saved Silas's livelihood. She'd become essential to this place in ways she hadn't intended, hadn't planned for. It should have frightened her. Being essential meant being trapped, meant owing debts she couldn't repay. But instead, she felt something else, something that might have been pride, or purpose, or the beginning of belonging. Silas appeared in the doorway, cleaned up from his earlier work, his hair still damp from washing. "You still awake?" "Couldn't sleep." He came in and sat at the table across from her, the lamplight casting shadows across his weathered face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I need to tell you something," Silas said finally. "When you first showed up here, I hired you because I needed a cook, and you were what was available. I figured you'd work for a while and move on, like most people do." May felt her defenses rising, preparing for dismissal. "But you're not most people," Silas continued. "You're extraordinary, May. The way you work, the way you think, the way you just handle things without falling apart. You saved Tom's life. You saved my herd. You've made this place better in every possible way. Don't say you're just doing your job. It's more than that, and you know it. Silas leaned forward, his eyes serious. I want you to know that you have a place here as long as you want it. Not just as a cook. As part of this ranch, part of what we're building. You and Emma both. May's throat tightened. Why? Because you've earned it. Because you're worth it. Because this place needs you. Silas paused. Because I need you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that neither was quite ready to fully examine. May looked at this man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who'd watched her daughter so she could save a man's life, who was offering her something that looked almost like permanence. I don't know how to stay, May said quietly. I've been running so long I forgot how to be still. Then maybe it's time you learned. Silas's voice was gentle. You're safe here, May. Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you're running from, it can't touch you here. May wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly it hurt. But trust was a muscle she'd let atrophy, and rebuilding it felt impossible. I'll try, she said finally. That's all I can promise. That's all I'm asking. Silas stood and moved toward the door, then paused. Get some rest, May. Tomorrow's another day, and this ranch needs you strong. After he left, May sat alone in the quiet kitchen, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into sleep. Outside, the wind moved through the mesquite trees. Inside, Emma slept peacefully, unaware that her mother was slowly learning what it meant to stop running. May rose and checked the locks on the doors, a habit she couldn't break, even here. Then she went to her small room, lay down beside her daughter, and closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept through the night without waking. The drought came slowly, like a thief that announced itself with silence. May noticed it first in the quality of the morning air. Drier somehow, thirstier, pulling moisture from her skin before she'd even begun the day's work. The cattle noticed next, their lowing taking on an edge of complaint as the grass in the north pasture began to thin and yellow, despite it only being late spring. By the third week without rain, the pond that served as the herd's water source had dropped 2 feet, exposing cracked mud banks that looked like broken skin. Silas spent his days riding the property lines, checking water levels, calculating how long they could last before decisions would need to be made. Hard decisions about which cattle to sell, which to keep, how to preserve what they'd built. May watched him return each evening more worn than the day before, the weight of responsibility carving new lines around his eyes. She made the food stretch further without making it seem scarce, adding vegetables from the small garden she'd started, using less meat but more flavor, ensuring the men stayed strong even as resources tightened. One morning, she was in the garden checking on the herbs she'd been cultivating when she noticed something that made her kneel down for a closer look. The plants nearest the cookhouse were thriving despite the drought, greener, fuller, more vibrant than they should have been. She dug down with her fingers and found the soil still moist several inches deep. May sat back on her heels, thinking. Then she walked around the cookhouse, studying the ground, the slight slope of the land, the way water would flow during the rains that weren't coming. There was a low spot behind the building where rainwater would naturally collect, and when she dug there, she found damp earth even in this dry spell. She found Silas in the barn, checking on a mare that had been favoring her front leg. He looked up when May entered, surprise crossing his face at seeing her away from the cookhouse during working hours. "Something wrong?" he asked. "Maybe something right." May moved closer, and Silas noticed she had dirt under her fingernails, dust on her skirt. The ground behind the cookhouse, it's holding water. There's a natural depression there that catches runoff and keeps the soil moist even without rain. Silas straightened, his attention fully focused on her now. "Show me." They walked together to the spot May had found, and Silas knelt to test the soil himself, his experienced hands reading the earth like a book. He dug deeper, finding the moisture May had described, then stood and surveyed the land with new eyes. "If this area is holding water, there might be a spring feeding it," Silas said slowly, his mind working through possibilities. "A small one, maybe seasonal, but if we could tap into it, you could water the kitchen garden at least," May finished. "Maybe keep the chickens supplied. It won't save the herd, but it would help." Silas looked at her, and something in his expression made May's breath catch. It wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition, the kind that saw past surfaces to the worth underneath. You keep finding solutions to problems I don't even know how to name yet, he said quietly. I just pay attention to what's there. Most people don't. They look without seeing. Silas turned back to the damp earth. I'll get the men to dig here, see if we can find the source. Even a small spring could make a difference. They found it 2 days later, not much more than a seep, really, water trickling up through limestone layers deep underground. But it was water that wouldn't stop even if the drought lasted months. Silas and the hands dug a shallow well, lined it with stones, and ran a small trough to May's garden and the chicken coop. It was a small victory, but it mattered. The chickens started laying again with reliable water. May's herbs flourished, and the men took heart from the fact that even in drought, they could still find reasons to hope. But hope was a fragile thing in dry country, and what came next tested it in ways none of them expected. May was feeding Emma one afternoon, sitting in the rocking chair with the baby at her breast, when she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders, moving fast. She stood carefully, keeping Emma secure, and moved to the window. 3 men dismounted in the yard. Strangers, dusty from travel, wearing clothes that marked them as townfolk rather than ranch hands. The one in front was tall and well-fed, with a face that suggested he was used to being listened to. The 2 behind him had the look of men hired for muscle rather than conversation. May's blood went cold. She recognized the type even if she didn't know the men specifically, the kind who came looking for something they believed they owned. Silas emerged from the barn, Tom and Jack flanking him. May watched through the window as words were exchanged, unable to hear but reading the tension in everybody's stance. The well-fed man pulled out a paper showing it to Silas. Even from the window, May could see Silas's shoulders stiffen, his jaw tighten. He said something short and harsh. The man responded, his gestures becoming more aggressive. One of the muscle men put his hand on his gun belt. May's heart hammered against her ribs. She moved quickly, settling Emma in her cradle and covering her with a light blanket. Then she went to the shelf where she kept the kitchen knives, selecting the longest one and hiding it in the folds of her skirt as she stepped outside. Don't care what your paper says, Silas was saying, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that preceded violence. She works for me, and she stays here. The debt is legal and binding, the well-fed man said. She owes the Riverside Hotel 6 months' wages for room and board. The proprietor has the right to collect. I don't owe anyone anything, May said, stepping into the yard. All 5 men turned to look at her. I worked every day I was there. Whatever they claim I owe is a lie. The well-fed man, a lawyer, May realized now, or something close to it, smiled without warmth. You signed a contract, Miss Wilder. Room, board, and childcare in exchange for labor. The proprietor claims you left before fulfilling your obligation. The proprietor tried to sell me to the highest bidder when I wouldn't agree to his other terms, May said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. I left because staying would have meant things I wasn't willing to do. The lawyer's smile didn't waver. That's not what his testimony states. He has witnesses willing to confirm you stole from him and fled in the night. Witnesses he paid, I'm sure. May took another step forward, and Silas moved to stand beside her, a wall of muscle and intention. I took nothing but my daughter and the clothes I was wearing. Nevertheless, the debt stands. You can return voluntarily to work it off, or we can compel you through legal means. She's not going anywhere, Silas said flatly. You can take your paper and your legal means and get off my property. One of the muscle men moved his hand closer to his gun. That sounds like obstruction of justice, Mr. Crow. That sounds like 3 men on the wrong side of a property line, Tom said, materializing with a rifle cradled in his arms. Jack appeared on the other side, similarly armed. Billy emerged from the barn with a shotgun that looked too big for his lanky frame. The tableau held for a long moment. 3 strangers facing 3 armed ranch hands, with Silas and May standing in the center like the eye of a storm about to break. I'm offering a peaceful resolution, the lawyer said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. Miss Wilder returns to settle her debt, or Mr. Crow pays it on her behalf. 6 months' wages at standard rate, say $180. That's robbery, May breathed. I wasn't even there 6 months. Plus interest and the cost of pursuing collection. The lawyer pulled out another paper, consulting it with theatrical precision. Total amount comes to $215. Silas's hand found May's elbow, steadying her as the number hit like a physical blow. $215 might as well have been $2,000. It was more money than May had seen in her entire life, more than she could earn in years. "I don't have that," May said, hating how small her voice sounded. "Then you'll have to return to work off the debt." "Over my dead body," Silas said, and the absolute conviction in his voice made the lawyer take a step back. "Mr. Crow, I understand you've developed a certain attachment to Miss Wilder's services, but the law is clear. The law can go to hell. That hotel owner is a liar and a cheat, and everyone in Redemption knows it. He runs a respectable business in front and sells women out the back. May worked honest for whatever time she was there, and the only debt is what he owes her for the work he didn't pay for." The lawyer's expression hardened. "I have documentation. You have lies written on expensive paper. Doesn't make them true." Silas took a step forward, and something in his bearing made all three strangers shift backward. "Now, I'm going to say this once and once only. May Wilder works for me. She stays here. If the Riverside Hotel has a problem with that, they can take it up with a real judge, not some bought and paid for collector. And if you three don't ride off my property in the next 30 seconds, my men are going to start showing you what we do to trespassers." Tom cocked his rifle with a sound that carried like thunder. Jack followed suit. Billy's hand shook slightly, but the shotgun stayed pointed in the right direction. The lawyer looked at May one more time, and she saw something calculated in his eyes, an assessment of value, of how much trouble she was worth. Whatever he saw in Silas's stance and the armed ranch hands made him decide the answer was not enough. "This isn't over," he said, tucking his papers back into his saddlebag. "Yeah, it is," Silas replied. "Ride out." They did, the three horses kicking up dust as they left at a canter that was just short of fleeing. May watched them go, her whole body shaking with reaction she'd kept suppressed while they were present. When they disappeared over the ridge, her legs nearly gave out. Silas caught her, one arm around her waist, holding her up. "I got you." "They'll come back," May whispered. "Men like that always come back." "Let them. They'll get the same answer." "What?" Silas turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes fierce. "May, listen to me. You're under my protection now. Anyone who wants to take you has to go through me first, and I promise you they won't make it." May wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself lean into the safety he was offering, but she'd learned young that safety was temporary and protection could be withdrawn at any moment. "You don't understand what you're up against," she said. "The hotel owner, he has connections, money, influence in town. He could make trouble for you, for the ranch. Then we'll handle trouble, but we won't handle it by giving you up." Tom stepped closer, still holding his rifle. "Miss May, you saved my life. I'd be rotting in the ground if not for you. Any man who wants to take you will have to kill me first." "Same here," Jack added quietly. "Me too," Billy chimed in, his young voice cracking slightly but determined. May looked at these men who'd become something like family in the weeks she'd been here, at Silas, who was offering protection without asking for payment, at the ranch that had somehow become more than just a place to work. The emotion rising in her throat threatened to choke her. "I can't let you risk everything for me," she managed. "You're not letting us do anything," Silas said firmly. "We're choosing this. You're worth fighting for, May. You and Emma both. The sooner you accept that, the easier this gets." From the cookhouse, Emma's cry pierced the air. Hungry or frightened by the commotion, May couldn't tell. The sound pulled her back to immediate reality, to the needs that didn't pause for crisis or fear. "I need to feed her," May said. "Go on, we'll keep watch tonight just in case they get ideas about coming back." May nodded and walked back to the cookhouse on legs that felt like they were made of water. Inside, she picked up Emma and settled into the rocking chair, the baby's familiar weight against her chest grounding her back into herself. As Emma nursed, May looked around the kitchen she'd made her own. The herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling beams, the shelves organized precisely, the stove she'd learned to manage perfectly. This place had become hers in ways that went beyond employment, beyond simple survival. And now it might all be torn away. That night, the men took shifts keeping watch. May could see them from her window, shadows moving in the darkness, rifles ready, standing between her and whatever might come over the horizon. The gesture moved her in ways she couldn't articulate, this evidence that she mattered enough to protect. She didn't sleep. Every sound made her jolt. Every movement of wind through the trees sounded like approaching horses. Emma seemed to sense her mother's fear and fussed more than usual, requiring constant soothing. Near midnight, there was a soft knock on the cookhouse door. May's heart jumped into her throat until she heard Silas's voice. "May, it's me. Can I come in?" She opened the door to find him standing there, hat in his hands, looking worn down by more than just the late hour. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "No." "Me neither." Silas stepped inside at her gesture, closing the door behind him. "Kept thinking about what that lawyer said about the debt and the hotel and all of it." "I'm sorry," May said quietly. "I should have told you I was running from something. Should have been honest from the start." "You don't owe me your history, May. What you did before you got here isn't my business unless you want it to be. But it's affecting you now, affecting the ranch, the men. That makes it your business." Silas set his hat on the table and ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration May was beginning to recognize. "Let me ask you something. Did you steal from that hotel?" "No." "Did you agree to anything beyond honest work for honest pay?" "No, I cleaned rooms, did laundry, helped in the kitchen. When the owner started suggesting other arrangements, I refused. He said I owed him for Emma's care, for the room, for every meal I ate. The debt kept growing no matter how much I worked." "So he was building a trap." "Yes." May's voice was barely above a whisper. "I realized if I stayed, I'd never get free. He'd keep adding to what I owed until I had to choose between impossible debt and the alternative he was offering." Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "So you ran." "In the middle of the night, with just Emma and the clothes we were wearing. I walked for 2 days before I got to redemption and saw your notice." "You did the right thing." "Did I?" "Because now he's coming after me with legal papers and hired men, and you're caught in the middle of it." Silas crossed to where May stood and took her hands in his, rough, calloused, warm. "Listen to me. I've been running this ranch for 20 years. I've fought drought, disease, cattle rustlers, banks trying to foreclose, and every other kind of hardship this land can throw at a man. You think some crooked hotel owner with fake debt papers scares me? He should. Men like that don't give up." "Neither do I." Silas squeezed her hands gently. "May, you're not alone anymore. You've got people who'll stand with you, fight for you. You've earned that by who you are and what you do. I'm just a cook. You're so much more than that, and you know it. You're the person who saved Tom's life, who found the spring that's keeping us going through drought, who's made this ranch feel like a home again instead of just a place to work until you die." Silas paused, seeming to wrestle with words. "You're important, May, to this ranch, to the men, to me." The last words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that made May's breath catch. She looked up at Silas, at this man who'd given her a chance when she had nothing, who was now willing to fight for her against enemies he hadn't made. "Why?" she asked. "Why does it matter so much?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, and May watched emotions flicker across his weathered face. Things he was deciding whether to say, walls he was considering whether to lower. "When Catherine died," he said finally, "I thought the best part of my life died with her. I shut down everything except work and survival. Didn't let anyone close, didn't allow myself to feel anything beyond what was necessary to get through each day. This ranch became a prison I built for myself, and I was content to serve that sentence until I died." He looked at May directly, letting her see the truth in his eyes. "Then you showed up, you and Emma, and slowly, without me even noticing it was happening, you started breaking down those walls. The ranch started feeling alive again. I started feeling alive again, and I realized I didn't want to go back to that prison, that half-life I'd been living." May felt tears prick at her eyes. "Silas, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not trying to pressure you or make you feel obligated. I just need you to understand why I'm willing to fight for you. It's not charity, and it's not just because you're a good cook. It's because you matter. Because what we've been building here, you, me, the men, this whole place, it's worth protecting." A tear slipped down May's cheek, and Silas reached up to brush it away with his thumb, the gesture so gentle it made her heart ache. "I don't know how to do this," May whispered. "I don't know how to let someone protect me, how to trust that it's real and not just temporary." "Then we'll figure it out together, one day at a time, one problem at a time." May nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Silas pulled her into a hug, careful, respectful, but solid and real. May let herself lean into it, let herself be held for the first time in longer than she could remember. They stood like that for a long moment, two broken people finding strength in each other's steadiness. Finally, Silas stepped back. "Try to get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out our next move." After he left, May did sleep, fitfully, but more than she'd expected. And when she woke before dawn to start breakfast, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the belief that she didn't have to face what was coming alone. The week that followed was tense, but quiet. No riders appeared. No lawyers came calling. Silas made a trip into Redemption and spoke with the sheriff, an honest man named Coleman, who'd known Silas for years. Coleman confirmed what they'd suspected. The Riverside Hotel's owner had a reputation for exploiting vulnerable women, and the debt papers were likely fabricated or wildly exaggerated. "Problem is," Coleman told Silas over coffee in his office, "proving it's one thing, stopping him from trying is another. He's got money and connections. If he wants to make trouble, he can." "So what do we do?" Coleman leaned back in his chair, considering. "Best option is to pay the debt, or what a real judge would consider the legitimate debt, not that inflated number they quoted you. Takes away his legal leverage. I could mediate it, make sure it's fair." "How much are we talking?" "Honest work for 2, maybe 3 months at most. $40, $50. I'll go over the hotel's records myself, make sure the number's real." Silas had nodded slowly, already calculating. $40 was money he could manage, especially with the ranch doing better thanks to May's work. It was worth it to remove the threat. But when he proposed the solution to May that evening, she refused outright. "I won't let you pay my debts," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor underneath. "I won't be obligated like that." "It's not about obligation, May. It's about solving the problem. It's about you spending money you need for the ranch on a problem I brought to your door. I can't allow that." They were in the kitchen, the supper dishes cleaned and put away, Emma asleep in her cradle. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. "You're being stubborn," Silas said. "I'm being realistic. What happens when the next problem comes? And the one after that? Do you just keep paying to make them go away?" "If that's what it takes to keep you safe, yes." May shook her head, frustration and something that looked like pain crossing her face. "You don't understand. I've been someone's debt my whole life. My father sold me to pay his gambling losses when I was 16. My husband married me to settle that debt, then treated me like property he'd purchased. I worked years to buy my freedom from him, and when he died, I thought I was finally done owing people. But then Emma came, and suddenly I was vulnerable again, and the hotel owner saw that vulnerability as something to exploit." She looked at Silas with eyes that held old pain and fierce determination. "I can't go from owing him to owing you. I can't trade one kind of debt for another, even if your terms are kinder. I need to stand on my own, to know I earned my place here rather than being bought into it." Silas felt something crack in his chest at her words, at the life they revealed, a life of being traded and sold and used by men who should have protected her. He understood her pride now, understood why accepting help felt like surrender. "What if it wasn't a debt?" he said slowly. "What if I paid the money but you worked it off? Not extra work, just your regular wages. I deduct $5 a month until it's paid back." May considered this, warring with herself. "That would take 8 months, maybe more." "Then it takes 8 months. At least you'd be here, safe, working honest. Better than the alternative." "I still don't like it." "I know. But sometimes the choices aren't between good and bad. They're between bad and worse. This is the least bad option we've got." May was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the gathering darkness. Finally, she nodded. "All right, but I want it in writing. The amount, the payment schedule, everything official. So we both know where we stand." "I can do that." Sheriff Coleman handled the negotiation with the hotel owner, and after reviewing the actual records and threatening legal consequences for fraud, he got the debt reduced to $42, 3 months' honest wages for room, board, and kitchen work. The hotel owner wasn't happy, but he took the payment rather than risk Coleman looking too closely at his other business practices. When Silas told May the amount, she insisted on seeing the receipt, studying it like a contract that would reveal hidden clauses. Then she drafted her own agreement, $42 to be repaid at $5 per month from her wages, with the balance paid in full within 9 months. She'd written it out in careful script, dated and signed it, and made Silas sign it too. "There," she'd said, folding the paper and putting it in the small wooden box where she kept her few important possessions. "Now it's official." Silas had wanted to tear the paper up, to tell her the money was a gift and the debt was forgiven, but he understood what the paper meant to May. It was proof that she wasn't owned, that her place here was earned rather than purchased. So he'd signed it and let her keep her pride, even though it cost him something to watch her need it so badly. 3 weeks after the confrontation with the lawyer, the drought broke. It started with clouds building on the western horizon, dark and pregnant with rain. By mid-afternoon, thunder was rolling across the prairie like distant artillery, and the wind had shifted to carry the smell of coming water. May stood on the cookhouse porch watching the storm approach with Emma in her arms. The baby's eyes were wide at the thunder, but she wasn't crying, just watching with the solemn attention of the very young, encountering something new. "It's rain, sweet girl," May murmured. "It's what's going to save us." The first drops fell fat and heavy, kicking up small explosions of dust where they struck the dry ground. Then the sky opened, and water came down in sheets that blurred the landscape into watercolor impressions. May stepped back under the porch roof, but she stayed outside, breathing in the smell of rain on parched earth. One of the best smells in the world, the smell of reprieve and second chances. Silas and the men came running from the fields, whooping like children, faces turned up to the downpour. They were soaked within seconds, but none of them cared. Water meant grass would grow, cattle would thrive, the pond would refill. Water meant life. Tom stopped in front of the cookhouse, grinning through the rain. "Miss May, we're saved!" May smiled back, feeling hope bloom in her chest like the flowers that would emerge from this storm. "We are." The rain lasted 3 days, steady and thorough, soaking deep into ground that had been thirsting for it. When it finally stopped, the world looked reborn. Grass already greening, wildflowers beginning to emerge, the creek running full and clear. The cattle spread out to graze with renewed energy, and the men worked with lighter hearts. May's garden exploded with growth. Her herbs flourished, and she started planting vegetables, tomatoes, squash, beans, peppers. The chickens laid eggs with renewed enthusiasm, and May began making plans for expanding the henhouse, maybe adding a dairy cow if Silas approved. The ranch transformed from a place barely surviving to something that felt almost prosperous. And at the center of it, May transformed too, from a woman running scared to someone who was beginning to believe she'd found a place to stay. One evening, after supper had been served and cleaned up, Silas found May in her garden, checking on the tomato plants she'd carefully staked. Emma was playing nearby in the grass, grabbing at grasshoppers with ineffective baby hands and laughing when they jumped away. "Your garden's coming in good," Silas observed. "It is. The rain helped, but the soil here is better than I expected. Rich, holds moisture well." "That's Catherine's doing. She used to garden here, composted everything, built up the soil over years." Silas paused, old pain flickering across his face. "After she died, I let it all go to weeds. Couldn't stand to look at it." May straightened, wiping her hands on her apron. "I hope it doesn't hurt you that I'm using it now." No, it's the opposite. It feels right having it productive again. Catherine would have liked you, I think. She was practical like you, saw problems and solved them without making a fuss." "Tell me about her," May said softly. "If it's not too hard." Silas settled against the fence post, his eyes distant with memory. "She was a teacher's daughter from Austin. Came out here to visit her aunt and ended up staying when I convinced her to marry me. Took her years to adjust to ranch life. She was a city girl, used to books and society and things more refined than dust and cattle. He smiled slightly, the expression softening his weathered features. But she never complained, never asked to leave. She learned to cook on that stove you use now, started that garden, made this place feel like a home instead of just a working ranch. We had 7 good years together before the fever took her. I'm sorry. Me too. For a long time I was so angry. At the fever, at the lack of a doctor close enough to help, at God for taking her when we'd finally built something good. That anger turned into the silence you walked into when you got here. May nodded, understanding. Grief has to go somewhere. It does. I buried mine in work and distance, pushed everyone away so I wouldn't have to feel anything. Silas looked at May directly. You changed that. You and Emma. You reminded me that life keeps going, that there can be good things after loss if you're willing to reach for them. May felt her throat tighten with emotion. I'm not trying to replace her. I know. You're not replacing anyone. You're just being yourself. And that's enough. More than enough. They stood in the growing darkness, the garden between them. Emma's happy sounds filling the space where words weren't needed. May thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. All the running, the fear, the desperate choices made in the name of survival. And she thought about what was growing here, in this soil Catherine had enriched, on this ranch that had become more than just a place to work. Silas, May said quietly, thank you for the chance you gave me, for standing up for me, for making me feel like I have value beyond what I can do. You do have value, May, more than you know. Emma chose that moment to toddle over on unsteady legs, grabbing at May's skirt for balance. May scooped her up, settling the baby on her hip, and looked at Silas with something in her eyes that might have been the beginning of trust. I'm starting to believe that, she said. It's scary, but I'm starting to believe it. Silas smiled, and it transformed his face into something almost young. That's all I'm asking. Just believe it long enough for it to become true. As they walked back toward the cookhouse together, the first stars emerging overhead, May felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace, but close enough to recognize it. She'd found something here worth fighting for, worth staying for. And for the first time since Emma was born, she let herself imagine a future that stretched beyond the next crisis, beyond the next place to run. She let herself imagine home. The imagining of home lasted exactly 3 weeks before the men came back. May was in the garden when she heard the horses, her hands full of green beans she'd been harvesting for the evening meal. Emma sat nearby in the shade, playing with wooden spoons May had given her to bang together. The sound of hoofbeats made May's head snap up, her body going rigid with recognition she felt before she saw. 4 riders this time. The lawyer wasn't among them. These were different men, harder men, the kind hired when legal pressure failed and force became necessary. They rode straight to the main house where Silas was working on the porch rail he'd been meaning to fix for months. May dropped the beans and scooped up Emma, moving quickly toward the house. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind had gone cold and sharp, the way it did when survival was at stake. She reached the porch just as the lead rider dismounted. He was older than the others, maybe 50, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that assessed everything with professional detachment. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, pulling it into a permanent arch that gave him a look of skeptical amusement. Silas Crow? His voice was graveled from years of tobacco or shouting or both. That's right. Silas straightened from his work, hammer still in hand. What's your business? Name's Garrett. I work for certain business interests in redemption. They've hired me to collect on a debt owed by May Wilder. That debt's been paid, Silas said flatly. Sheriff Coleman handled it 3 weeks back. You're wasting your time. Garrett's expression didn't change. The debt we're collecting isn't money, Mr. Crow. It's time owed. Miss Wilder entered into a contract for 6 months of labor. She provided less than 3. That means she owes 3 months of work to be rendered at the Riverside Hotel under the original terms of employment. That's a lie, May said, stepping forward even as every instinct screamed at her to run. I never signed any contract, and I worked honest every day I was there. You put your mark on the employment ledger when you started, Garrett said, pulling out a folded paper. That ledger entry constitutes a binding agreement under territorial law. The hotel owner has the right to compel completion of the contract. Silas took the paper and studied it, his jaw tightening as he read. May couldn't see what it said, but she could see the careful forgery of it, the way official words could be twisted to make slavery look legal. "This is garbage," Silas said, crumpling the paper. "No judge would uphold it." "Maybe, maybe not. But collecting on it doesn't require a judge, just enforcement of existing contract law." Garrett's hand rested casually on his gun belt. "Miss Wilder can come peaceful, or we can make it difficult. Either way, she's coming." The other three riders had spread out slightly, creating a semicircle that cut off easy escape routes. May recognized the tactic. These were men who'd done this before, who knew how to corner prey. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said, and his voice carried a weight that made even Garrett pause. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Crow. This is a legal matter. Interfering makes you party to her contract violation." "I don't give a damn about your fake contract. May works for me, she stays with me, and you four can ride off my property before things turn unpleasant." Garrett sighed like a man disappointed but not surprised. "I was hoping we could handle this civilized." His hand moved toward his gun, and everything happened at once. Silas swung the hammer in a vicious arc that caught Garrett across the jaw, sending him sprawling backward. One of the other riders went for his weapon, but Tom appeared from the barn with his rifle raised, the shot firing over the man's head close enough to make him freeze. "Next one goes through your chest," Tom said calmly. Jack and Billy emerged from opposite sides of the yard, both armed, both positioned to cover different angles. It was coordinated in a way that suggested they'd been watching, waiting, prepared for exactly this scenario. May clutched Emma tighter, the baby crying now from the noise and tension. She backed toward the cookhouse, mind racing through possibilities. They couldn't win this fight. Even if they drove these men off, more would come. The hotel owner had resources and determination, and he'd keep sending men until he got what he wanted, or someone ended up dead. Garrett pushed himself up from the dirt, blood streaming from his split lip, his eyes gone hard and cold. "That was a mistake, Crow. First of many you're about to experience if you don't get back on that horse," Silas replied, retrieving his hammer and hefting it like a weapon. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. My men—" "Your men are covered by rifles held by men who won't miss. You want to test whether you can draw and fire before Tom puts a bullet through your skull? Go ahead and try." The standoff held, seconds stretching into something brittle and dangerous. May could see Garrett calculating odds, weighing the value of success against the cost of failure. She saw the moment he decided it wasn't worth it. Not today, not like this. "This isn't over," Garrett said, mounting his horse with careful movements. "We'll be back with the law, proper warrants, maybe the territorial marshal. Then we'll see how tough you are." "I'll be exactly as tough as I am now," Silas said. "Bring whoever you want. Answer stays the same." Garrett spat blood into the dust and wheeled his horse around. The other three riders followed, and together they left at a canter that kicked up clouds of red dirt. May watched them go until they were just specks on the horizon, then her legs gave out. Silas caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her waist, the other steadying Emma between them. "I got you." "They'll come back," May gasped, her whole body shaking with reaction. "They'll bring more men, legal papers. Maybe the marshal like he said. Silas, you can't fight this. You can't fight the law." "Watch me." Silas helped her to the porch steps, settling her down gently while Tom, Jack, and Billy maintained their positions, still watching the horizon. Emma was wailing now, terrified by her mother's fear and the violence she was too young to understand. May tried to soothe her with shaking hands, but the baby's cries only intensified. "Let me," Silas said, and before May could protest, he'd taken Emma and settled her against his shoulder, one large hand cupping her small head. He walked in slow circles, humming that tuneless sound May had heard before, and gradually Emma's cries subsided into hiccuping sobs, and then silence. May watched through tears she couldn't stop, seeing this hard man gentling her daughter while her world threatened to collapse around them. "I have to go," she said when she could speak again. "I have to leave before they come back. It's the only way to protect you, protect the ranch." "No." Silas's voice was absolute. "Silas, please listen." "No, May. You're not running again. You're done running." "You don't understand what they'll do." The hotel owner has connections, money, judges in his pocket. If he wants me back badly enough, he'll make it happen, and he'll destroy anyone standing in his way. Silas handed Emma back to May and knelt in front of her so they were eye level. His face was set in lines of determination that looked like they'd been carved from the same stone as the ranch itself. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We get our own lawyer, we talk to Coleman about what legal protections you actually have, we document everything the hotel owner did wrong. We fight this the right way." There is no right way. The law isn't made to protect people like me. Maybe not, but I've got some pull in this territory too. I've been paying taxes and employing men and building something real here for 20 years. That counts for something. And if it doesn't, if the law really is just bought and paid for corruption, then we'll handle it another way. May searched his face, seeing the absolute conviction there, the willingness to burn everything down rather than surrender what he'd chosen to protect. It terrified her and filled her with something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Why risk everything for me?" Silas's expression softened, and he reached up to brush tears from her cheek with calloused fingers. "Because you matter. Because what we've built here matters. Because I'll be damned if I let some crooked hotel owner tear apart the first good thing I've had in 7 years. I'm not worth this." "That's where you're wrong." Silas stood and offered her his hand. "Come on. We need to make plans." May took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Emma had fallen asleep against her shoulder, exhausted by crying, and May adjusted her carefully as they walked toward the house together. Tom, Jack, and Billy followed, rifles still ready, forming a protective circle that made May's throat tighten with gratitude and guilt in equal measure. Inside, Silas spread out paper on the kitchen table while May settled Emma in her cradle. When she returned, she found him writing in careful script, documenting everything: the dates May had worked at the hotel, the conditions she'd described, the lawyer's first visit, Garrett's threats today. "We need a timeline," Silas explained. "Every interaction, every piece of evidence that shows the hotel owners operating outside the law. Coleman will need this." May sat down and began helping, her memory for details serving them well. She recalled names of other women who'd worked at the hotel and disappeared, described the ledger system the owner used to inflate debts, explained the pattern of threats and coercion that kept vulnerable women trapped. As she talked, Silas wrote, and May watched his face grow darker with each revelation. When she finished, he sat back and looked at her with something like fury burning in his eyes. "How many women?" he asked quietly. "I don't know, maybe a dozen while I was there, maybe more before." And nobody stopped him. Who would? The women have no standing, no resources. The men who know either don't care or benefit from it. The law looks the other way because his money keeps the right people quiet. Silas's fist came down on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee cups. "That ends now." Over the next 3 days, Silas made 3 trips to town, each time returning with news and plans. Sheriff Coleman was sympathetic but limited in what he could do without proof. The territorial judge was due to visit Redemption in 2 weeks for circuit court. If they could present evidence then, they might get a ruling that would protect May permanently. But 2 weeks was a long time when men with guns wanted you gone. The ranch settled into a state of armed vigilance. The men took watches in shifts, day and night. May cooked with a rifle leaning against the wall beside the stove. Silas barely slept, checking the perimeter constantly, his hand never far from the gun he'd started wearing again. Emma sensed the tension and grew fussy, crying more than usual, sleeping poorly. May walked her for hours each night, singing soft songs and trying to calm fears the baby couldn't articulate, but clearly felt. One evening, 5 days after Garrett's visit, May was walking Emma around the cookhouse when she heard voices from the porch. Silas and Tom, talking quietly while keeping watch. "Can't keep this up forever, boss," Tom was saying. "We're all running on fumes, and the work's piling up. Something's got to give." "I know, just need to make it 2 more weeks until the judge arrives." "What if they don't wait 2 weeks? What if they come back tomorrow with a dozen men instead of 4? Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Then we make our stand. We've got good position here, good sight lines, enough weapons. Against a dozen armed men?" "Boss, I'd die for Miss May in a heartbeat, you know that. But I don't want to die stupid." "Neither do I. But what's the alternative? Let them take her?" Maybe, maybe she should go somewhere else, just until the judge rules. Somewhere safe where they can't find her. May froze, Emma heavy in her arms, waiting for Silas's response. Where? Silas asked. Where could she go that they wouldn't follow? And even if we found somewhere, sending her away feels like giving up, like admitting they've won. Sometimes tactical retreat isn't surrender, it's smart strategy. I'll talk to May, Silas said finally. See what she wants to do. May stepped onto the porch before she could lose her nerve. Both men turned, surprised to see her. I heard, she said simply, and the answer is no. I'm not running again. May, Tom has a point. I've been running my whole life, Silas. From my father, from my husband, from the hotel owner, from every person who thought they could control me because I was vulnerable. I'm done. If they want me, they'll have to take me by force, and I won't make it easy. Silas studied her face, seeing the steel underneath the fear. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. I found something here worth fighting for. I won't give it up without a fight. Tom nodded slowly, respect clear in his expression. Then we fight together. The next morning brought visitors, but not the kind they'd been expecting. Sheriff Coleman rode in with another man, older, distinguished-looking, wearing clothes that marked him as educated money rather than working land. Silas, Coleman called, got someone here who wants to talk to you. This is Judge Patterson. He was passing through and I told him about your situation. Judge Patterson dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body had grown stiffer than his spirit. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the air of someone who'd seen enough of life's cruelty to be genuinely moved by compassion. Mr. Crow, he said, extending his hand, Sheriff Coleman tells me you're harboring a woman being pursued under false contract claims. Silas shook his hand warily. That's right. May Wilder. She's my cook, and she's under my protection. I'd like to hear her side of the story. If I may? May was summoned, and she told her story again, calmly this time, with the kind of factual precision that came from having repeated it enough to strip away the emotion. Judge Patterson listened without interrupting, his face growing more severe as she described the hotel owner's practices. When she finished, he removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, a gesture that seemed to give him time to compose his thoughts. Miss Wilder, he said finally, what you're describing is indentured servitude at best, human trafficking at worst. Both are illegal under territorial law, regardless of what contracts may have been signed or marks made in ledgers. The hotel owner's lawyer seemed to think otherwise, May said. The hotel owner's lawyer is mistaken, or deliberately misleading you, which is worse. Patterson replaced his spectacles. I'm prepared to issue a preliminary ruling right now if you'll accept it. This ruling would state that any contract allegedly signed by you is void due to coercive circumstances and fraudulent terms. It would prohibit the hotel owner and his agents from attempting to collect on said contract through any means. May's breath caught. You can do that? Just like that? I can issue a preliminary ruling that will hold until formal proceedings can be conducted at circuit court. Given the circumstances, the threats, the armed intimidation, I believe such a ruling is warranted to prevent immediate harm. What about the hotel owner? Silas asked. Won't he just ignore it? Possibly. But ignoring a judge's order is contempt of court, which carries severe penalties including jail time and fines. Most men, no matter how corrupt, think twice before deliberately defying judicial authority. Patterson pulled out a leather portfolio and began writing. I'll need statements from both of you, documentation of the threats and attempts at forced collection. Sheriff Coleman will serve the order personally and make clear that any further harassment will result in criminal charges. May felt tears sting her eyes, but these were different from the tears she'd cried before. These were relief, the release of tension held so long it had become part of her structure. Thank you, she managed. Patterson looked at her with grandfatherly kindness. Miss Wilder, I've served as a judge for 30 years. I've seen many men use the law as a weapon against those who can't defend themselves. It's my privilege to occasionally use that same law as a shield for those who need protecting. He finished writing and handed the document to Coleman. Serve this today. Make sure the hotel owner understands that if he sends any more men to this ranch, he'll answer to me personally. Coleman grinned. Be my pleasure, Your Honor. After they left, May stood in the yard holding the copy of the ruling Patterson had given her, reading it over and over to make sure the words were real. Silas came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "It's over," he said quietly. "Is it? Really?" Patterson's word carries weight, and now we have legal protection instead of just guns and stubbornness. Silas turned to look at her. "You're safe, May. You and Emma both." May let herself lean against him, just slightly, testing the reality of it. Silas's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, May let herself fully relax. "I need to make dinner," she said after a moment, but she didn't move. "Dinner can wait a few minutes." They stood like that while the sun tracked across the sky and the ranch settled back into its normal rhythms. Tom and Jack had already gone back to work, their rifles put away, the tension bleeding out of their postures. Billy was whistling as he carried water to the horses, his young face bright with relief. Emma woke from her nap and called out, and May reluctantly pulled away from Silas's warmth to tend to her. But as she walked toward the cookhouse, she felt lighter than she had in months, maybe years. The weight of being hunted had lifted, and underneath it she found herself. That evening, May made a feast. Not because it was required or expected, but because she wanted to celebrate. She made fried chicken that crackled with perfectly seasoned crust, mashed potatoes whipped with butter and cream, gravy rich and smooth, green beans cooked with bacon, biscuits that rose high and golden, and an apple pie from the dried apples she'd been saving for something special. The men ate like they were storing up against future famine, praising every bite with the kind of reverence that made May blush. When they'd finished and gone to the bunkhouse, Silas helped her clean up without being asked. "You didn't have to make all this," he said, drying a plate with careful attention. "I wanted to, felt like celebrating." "We should be celebrating you. You stood your ground, refused to run. That took courage." May shook her head. "I was terrified every second. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs doing despite the fear." Silas set down the plate and turned to face her fully. "May, I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his voice made May's heart stutter. "All right." "When you first came here, I told myself I was just hiring a cook, filling a practical need. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. You became more than that." Silas paused, seeming to gather his words. "You brought life back to this place. You reminded me what it feels like to have something worth protecting, worth fighting for." "Silas, let me finish. I'm not good with words, so I need to say this while I've got the nerve." He took her hands, his grip gentle despite the roughness of his skin. "I care about you, May. Not just as my cook, not just as someone under my protection. As a woman I admire and respect and love." The last word hung in the air between them, fragile and enormous. May felt her breath catch, felt tears sting her eyes for the third time that day. "I'm not asking you to feel the same," Silas continued quickly. "I know you've been through hell, that trust doesn't come easy for you. But I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that when I fought for you, it wasn't just duty or stubbornness. It was because losing you would have broken something in me I didn't even know could break again." May looked at this man who'd given her shelter and safety, who'd stood between her and violence, who'd treated her daughter with tenderness and her with respect. She thought about the weeks she'd spent here, the slow unwinding of her defenses, the gradual realization that not all men were predators and not all protection came with strings attached. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Every time I've trusted someone, they've used it against me. Every time I've let myself care, it's turned into a cage." "I know, and I'm not asking you to trust me completely or love me back right now. I'm just asking you to stay. To give this, whatever this is between us, a chance to grow without pressure or expectations." May squeezed his hands, feeling the strength in them, the steadiness. "I can do that." Relief washed across Silas's face. "That's all I need." He started to pull away, but May held onto his hands, keeping him close. "Silas, I need you to understand something too. I'm broken in ways that might never fully heal. I've got scars that go deeper than skin. Trusting you, letting you close, it terrifies me more than any threat from the hotel owner ever could." I know, but I'm willing to try. Because what we've built here, what you've given me and Emma, it's the closest thing to home I've ever known. And I think maybe I could love you too, given time and patience and proof that this is real. Silas smiled, and it transformed his entire face into something young and hopeful. I've got nothing but time and patience, and I'll prove it's real every day for the rest of my life if that's what it takes. May rose on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek, quick and light, a promise of possibilities rather than a claim. Then we'll figure it out together. Together, Silas agreed. Outside, the Texas night settled over the ranch with its familiar sounds, cattle lowing in the distance, crickets singing their endless song, wind moving through grass that was finally green again after the drought. Inside the cookhouse, May and Silas stood hand in hand, two broken people who'd found each other in the midst of their separate survivals and decided that maybe, just maybe, they could build something whole. Emma slept peacefully in her cradle, dreaming whatever dreams babies dreamed, unaware that her mother had just chosen to stop running and start living. The lamps burned low, casting warm light across worn wooden floors and walls that had heard too much silence for too many years. And in that warm light, in the space between what had been and what might be, May Wilder finally allowed herself to believe in second chances. The believing came in small increments, like spring arriving one blade of grass at a time. May woke the morning after Silas's confession to find him already working in the yard, repairing the chicken coop fence that had been listing sideways for weeks. He looked up when she emerged with Emma on her hip, and the smile that crossed his face was so genuine it made her heart stutter. No demands, no expectations, just pleasure at seeing her. "Morning," he called. "Morning. Coffee's ready when you want it." "Be there in a minute." Such ordinary words, such ordinary exchanges. But May had learned that ordinary was precious when you'd spent years living in fear of what extraordinary might cost you. She made breakfast while Emma played with wooden spoons on a blanket, and when Silas came in, he washed his hands without being asked and poured his own coffee. They ate together in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling, and when he left to check on the cattle, he touched May's shoulder in passing, gentle, brief, asking nothing. May stood at the window watching him walk toward the pasture, his broad shoulders outlined against the morning sun, and felt something shift in her chest. Not love yet, not quite, but the space where love might grow if she could just stop being afraid long enough to let it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost miraculous in its normalcy. The ranch work continued, cattle to tend, fences to mend, hay to cut and store. May's garden flourished, producing vegetables in abundance, and she began preserving the excess, filling jars with pickles and tomatoes and beans against the coming winter. Emma grew stronger and more adventurous, pulling herself up on furniture and taking wobbling steps that made May's heart leap into her throat every time. Silas carved her a set of wooden blocks and spent his evenings on the floor with her, building towers for her to knock down while May cooked or mended or simply watched them together. The men noticed the change in their boss, the way his face had softened, the way he smiled more freely, the way he seemed lighter despite working just as hard. Tom caught May's eye one evening and nodded toward where Silas was teaching Emma to stack her blocks. "Haven't seen him like that since Miss Catherine was alive," Tom said quietly. "You're good for him, Miss May." "He's good for me too," May admitted. "We can all see that. You stopped looking over your shoulder all the time." May realized it was true. She'd stopped checking the horizon for approaching riders, stopped flinching at sudden sounds, stopped sleeping with one ear always listening for danger. The judge's ruling had held. Sheriff Coleman had reported that the hotel owner had made no further attempts at collection, and rumor had it he was closing the Riverside Hotel and leaving redemption entirely. "You think it's really over?" May asked Tom. "I think men like that don't give up easy, but they do give up when the cost gets too high. Judge Patterson made the cost too high." Tom paused. "But even if it's not over, we're ready. And you're not alone anymore." The reminder settled warm in May's chest. She wasn't alone. She had Silas, the ranch hands who'd become protective as older brothers, the community slowly forming around her. It was more than she'd ever had, more than she'd thought possible. 3 weeks after the judge's ruling, Silas asked May to walk with him after supper. Emma had fallen asleep early, worn out from a day of exploration, and Billy had volunteered to listen for her while they stepped out. They walked toward the oak tree that stood at the edge of the property, ancient and gnarled, its branches spreading wide enough to shade a dozen people. The evening was cooling, that perfect temperature between day's heat and night's chill, and the sky was doing that thing it did in Texas, turning colors that seemed impossible, like someone had spilled paint across heaven. "I've been thinking," Silas said as they reached the tree. "About what?" "About the future. About what happens next." He leaned against the oak's trunk, and May settled beside him, their shoulders touching. "The ranch is doing well, better than it has in years. We'll have good income from the cattle sale this fall, and with your garden producing the way it is, we're nearly self-sufficient for food." "That's good." "It is, but I'm not talking just about the ranch." Silas turned to look at her directly. "May, you've been here almost 4 months now. You've more than proven yourself as a cook, as a healer, as someone this place needs. But I'm wondering what you want beyond just working here." May's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you see yourself staying? Not just until the next crisis or the next threat, but permanently. Building a life here, making this your home." The question hung between them, weighted with possibilities May was still learning to reach for. She looked out at the ranch, the house with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn where horses shifted and settled, the bunkhouse where men she'd learned to trust were finishing their evening routines. "I want to," May said carefully, "but wanting something and believing I can have it are different things. What would it take for you to believe it?" May was quiet for a long moment, searching for words to name the fear that still lived in her bones. "I keep waiting for the other boot to drop, for the conditions to be revealed, for the price that comes due. Nothing good has ever been permanent in my life, Silas. Everything's been conditional, temporary, dependent on someone else's whims. I understand that. But May, look at what you've built here. You created that garden from dead ground. You saved Tom's life when infection would have killed him. You found the spring that kept us going through drought. None of that was temporary or conditional. That was you, creating something permanent through your own hands. That's different. Is it? You're so used to being vulnerable, to having no control that you can't see your own strength. But I see it. The men see it. Hell, Emma sees it. Look at how fearless she is, how confident. That comes from you, from the security you give her even when you don't feel secure yourself." May felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm scared, Silas. I'm scared of trusting this, of believing it's real, and then having it torn away." "I know, but being scared and doing it anyway, that's courage." Silas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "I can't promise nothing will ever go wrong. Life doesn't work that way, but I can promise that whatever comes, we face it together. You're not alone anymore, May. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." May looked at their joined hands, at the way his strength didn't diminish hers, but somehow amplified it. She thought about the past 4 months, about the slow unwinding of her defenses, about the gradual realization that this man meant what he said. "I want to stay," she said finally. "I want to build a life here, with you. I want Emma to grow up knowing she has a home, people who love her, a place where she's safe." Silas's grip tightened on her hand. "Then stay. Not as my cook, not as my employee. Stay as my partner, my equal. Help me run this ranch, make decisions, build something that belongs to both of us." "Partners?" May's voice was barely a whisper. "Partners in everything." Silas paused, and May could see him gathering courage for what came next. "May Wilder, I'm asking you to marry me. Not because you owe me anything, not because you need protection, but because I love you, and I want to build a life with you. A real life, based on respect and partnership, and the kind of love that grows slow and deep and permanent." May's breath caught. Marriage. The word carried so much weight. Her first marriage had been a transaction, a debt paid in flesh and obedience. The thought of entering that contract again, even with Silas, sent panic skittering through her veins. Silas must have seen it in her face because he added quickly, "I'm not your first husband, May. I know what he was, what he did. I'm not asking you to be property or possession. I'm asking you to be my wife in the truest sense, my partner, my equal, someone I respect and cherish and choose every single day. I don't know how to be that kind of wife, May admitted. I only know how to survive marriage, not how to live in it. Then we'll learn together. We've been learning together all along, how to trust, how to lean on each other, how to build something good from broken pieces. We can learn this too. May looked at him, this man who'd given her safety without demanding payment, who'd fought for her without expecting gratitude, who'd loved her daughter without needing to claim her. She thought about the life they could build together, the home they could create, the future that might actually be permanent. Yes, she said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff into water she couldn't see the bottom of. Yes, I'll marry you. Silas's face transformed with joy so pure it made May laugh despite her tears. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close but gentle, and May let herself lean into him, let herself believe that this time, this man, this choice might actually be the right one. They stood under the oak tree as the sky darkened and the first stars emerged, two people who'd found each other in the midst of their separate survivals and decided to stop surviving alone. When they returned to the ranch, hand in hand, Tom took one look at their faces and grinned. About damn time. We're getting married, Silas announced, and the men erupted in whoops and congratulations. May blushed under the attention, but she smiled too, letting their genuine happiness wash over her. These men had become family, and their joy at this news felt like a blessing she hadn't known she needed. We'll have a party, Jack declared, a proper celebration. Nothing too fancy, May protested. Don't care about fancy. Just want to celebrate Miss May finally agreeing to make an honest man out of the boss. The wedding happened 3 weeks later under that same oak tree, with Sheriff Coleman officiating and the ranch hand standing witness. May wore a dress she'd sewn herself from the blue fabric Silas had bought her months ago, simple but clean and new. Emma toddled between guests in a white dress May had stitched with painstaking care, her baby laughter ringing out across the evening. Silas wore his best shirt, freshly washed and pressed, his hair combed back and his face scrubbed clean. When May walked toward him, his eyes went bright with something that looked like wonder, and May felt her own eyes sting in response. The ceremony was brief and practical, the words stripped down to essentials. May promised to honor and respect Silas, to be his partner in building their life together. Silas promised to protect and cherish May, to treat her as his equal in all things. There was no mention of obedience, no language of possession, just two people choosing each other with clear eyes and open hearts. When Coleman pronounced them married, Silas kissed May with gentle reverence, and the assembled crowd cheered. Emma clapped her hands in imitation, not understanding but delighted by the joy surrounding her. The celebration that followed was simple but genuine. Tom had hunted a deer and May had cooked it with all the skills she possessed. There was cornbread and beans, roasted vegetables from the garden, pies made from wild berries the men had collected. Someone produced a fiddle, and there was dancing on the packed earth of the yard, laughter rising into the darkening sky. May danced with Silas, his hand warm and steady at her waist, and let herself feel the fullness of the moment. This was her wedding, her choice, her life beginning in a way it never had before. Happy? Silas murmured against her ear. Terrified, May admitted. But yes, happy too. That's honest. I'll take it. As the evening wore on and Emma grew fussy with exhaustion, May and Silas slipped away from the celebration. Silas had spent the past week building an addition onto the cookhouse, a proper bedroom with a real bed, a door that closed for privacy, windows that let in light and air. It was simple but sturdy, built with the same careful attention he brought to everything. May settled Emma in the cradle that now sat in the corner of their room, covering her daughter with the quilt one of the neighboring ranch wives had gifted them. Emma's eyes were already closing, and within moments she was deeply asleep. Silas stood in the doorway, watching May with an expression that made her heart race. When she straightened from the cradle, he crossed to her and took her hands. May, I need you to understand something. I know what marriage meant in your first one. I know the expectations, the demands, the ways a man can use a wife. His voice was low and serious. That's not what this is. You're my wife now, yes, but that means you're my partner, not my property. Anything that happens between us, it happens because we both want it, both choose it. No obligations, no demands. May felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she'd been holding since agreeing to this. I don't know how to be a wife like that. I don't know what you want from me. I want you to be yourself, to feel safe, to know that your choices matter and your voice counts. Silas cupped her face gently. We don't have to do anything tonight except sleep beside each other if that's what you want. We've got the rest of our lives to figure out the rest. The kindness of it, the patience, made May's eyes sting with tears. She'd been bracing herself for demands, for the price that always came due, and instead she was being offered time and choice and respect. I want to trust you, she whispered. I want to believe this is real. Then trust me one day at a time. Believe it one moment at a time. There's no rush, May. We've got nothing but time. May stood on her toes and kissed him, not the chaste kiss of their ceremony, but something deeper, more searching. Silas responded with careful passion, his hands moving to her waist but going no further, letting her set the pace and boundaries. When they finally pulled apart, May was breathing hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. But it wasn't fear, it was something else, something that felt like the beginning of desire freely chosen. Stay with me tonight, she said. Just stay close. Help me learn how to do this. Always, Silas promised. They lay down together in the bed Silas had built, and May fitted herself against his side, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist. It should have felt vulnerable, exposing, but instead it felt safe. Protected not by walls, but by the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing, the warmth of his body, the strength that asked nothing of her. May closed her eyes and let herself rest. Truly rest, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The months that followed were a gradual awakening, like land recovering from drought. May learned to trust Silas's constancy, to believe that his patience wasn't manipulation, but genuine respect. She learned that partnership meant having a voice in decisions, that her opinions on ranch management were not just tolerated, but valued. Silas taught her to ride properly, to handle cattle, to read the land the way he did. May taught him about herbs and healing, about preserving food, about creating beauty in small spaces. They worked side by side, their skills complementing rather than competing, building something neither could have achieved alone. Emma thrived in the security of it, growing from a cautious baby into a bold toddler who ran fearlessly across the ranch, calling Papa to Silas and Mama to May with equal confidence. Watching Silas with her daughter, patient, gentle, genuinely delighted by her, May felt the last of her defenses crumble. This was real. This was permanent. This was home. One evening in late fall, nearly a year after May had first walked through the ranch gates, she and Silas sat on the porch watching the sunset. Emma slept inside, worn out from a day of helping May harvest the last of the garden vegetables. The air carried the scent of coming winter, that particular crispness that meant change was approaching. I've been thinking, May said, leaning against Silas's shoulder. Dangerous pastime, he teased gently. About the ranch, about expanding the garden next spring, maybe adding a dairy cow. And I've been talking to some of the women in town about starting a herb cooperative, sharing knowledge about healing plants, selling the excess. Silas smiled. You're planning the future. I am. May paused, letting the significance of that settle between them. I'm not just surviving anymore, Silas. I'm living, building, creating something that will last. How does it feel? Terrifying. Wonderful. Real. May turned to look at him directly. I love you. I don't think I've actually said it out loud, but I do. I love you, and I love this life we're building, and I love that Emma will grow up knowing what a good man looks like. Silas's eyes went bright with emotion. I love you too, May. Have since the day you saved Tom's life, though it took me longer to realize it. That was the day you stopped being my employer and started being something more. What am I now? May considered the question seriously. My partner, my home, my proof that second chances are real and worth reaching for. Silas pulled her close, and they sat together as the last light bled from the sky and the ranch settled into its evening rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed peacefully. In the bunkhouse, men laughed over a card game. In the house behind them, Emma slept the deep sleep of the completely secure. This was the life May had built from nothing, from desperation and determination, from running and finally stopping, from survival and slowly, carefully learning to thrive. She'd walked through Silas's gates carrying only a baby and hope so fragile it was barely there. Now she had a home, a husband who treated her as an equal, a daughter who knew only safety and love, and a future that stretched out before her like rich soil waiting to be planted. The ranch had been Silas's prison, the place where grief had calcified into silence. May had transformed it into something living and vital, and in doing so had transformed herself. She was no longer the woman running from debt and shame, no longer the mother desperate to protect her child with nothing but her own fragile strength. She was May Crow, partner in a working ranch, healer and cook and gardener, wife to a good man, mother to a thriving daughter. She was someone who mattered, who contributed, who'd earned her place through work and courage, and the stubborn refusal to give up. As the stars emerged one by one overhead, May thought about the girl she'd been. Sold to pay debts, married to a man who saw her as property, desperate and afraid, and certain she'd never be more than what others made her. That girl would never have believed this life was possible. But May had learned something in the years since arriving at the Crow Ranch. The life you're born into doesn't have to be the life you die in. With courage and luck and the right people standing with you, transformation was possible, healing was possible, home was possible. "What are you thinking about?" Silas asked quietly. "About silence," May said. "About the difference between the silence that destroys and the silence that heals." Silas nodded, understanding. "I built the first kind. You brought the second. We built it together. That's the difference. Together instead of alone." Inside the house, Emma stirred and called out sleepily. May rose to tend to her, but Silas stood too. "I'll get her," he said. "You've been on your feet all day." May watched him go, this man who'd offered her protection without price, who'd fought for her when she couldn't fight for herself, who'd given her daughter a father's love without needing blood ties to justify it. She listened to his voice through the open door, gentle and warm, as he settled Emma back to sleep. The land around her was the same land that had been here when she arrived, hard and beautiful, demanding and generous, unforgiving of mistakes but faithful in its constancy. But it was also different, transformed by rain and work and care into something more productive, more alive, like her. May Wilder had walked into the Crow Ranch broken and desperate, carrying a baby and asking for nothing but a chance. May Crow stood on her own porch now, rooted and strong, having found something she'd thought existed only in stories people told to make the hard parts bearable. She'd found home. Not the kind that sheltered you from storms, but the kind that stood with you through them. Not the kind built from walls and roofs, but the kind built from choices and courage and the daily decision to show up and do the work. Silas returned and slipped his arm around her waist, and together they stood looking out at the ranch they'd built together, at fields that would need plowing come spring, at fences that would need mending, at all the work that made up a life lived deliberately and well. "Ready for bed?" Silas asked. May smiled and took his hand. "Ready for tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that." They walked inside together, closing the door on the night and opening it on the future they'd chosen. And in that small gesture, the simple act of coming home, May Wilder Crow found the peace she'd been searching for since the day she was old enough to understand what it meant to be safe. The ranch settled into silence, but it was the good kind, the healing kind, the kind that promised rest and renewal and the strength to face whatever came next, together.